Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I think we're going to touch on most of those today with my guest, Joy Ditto. She is the president and CEO of the American Public Power Association. Joy, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Robert. And as you noted, I'm Joy Ditto. I'm president and CEO of the American Public Power Association. APPA is a national trade association representing the interests of approximately 2,000 public power utilities that are not-for-profit nationwide in 49 states and 5 territories, and serving close to 50 million people, 50.
Okay, that's great. Well, you beat me to the punch. I was going to tell you to introduce yourself, and you did it right off
I
the
did
bat.
it. I did it.
That's great. So one of the things now in the wake of the California and Texas blackouts, in my view, it should be an inflection point in how we think about the grid nationally and what is figuring into resilience and reliance. So reliability. But I'm curious what your view, looking at those events in the rearview mirror, are the and how they're being discussed and how we're going to address those issues. But how are the interests of the public power agencies? Are they different from the investor-owned utilities, different from the cooperatives in how they think about this, or is everyone thinking about this in the same way?
I think there's some similarities in certain ways and some differences in others. So thanks for that
Let's start
question.
with the differences, because that's to me the part that I think that isn't being discussed very much. And I also want to talk about the scale of the grid, but by all means, please tell me, what are the differences then?
Well, so public power utilities are housed at the local level, typically associated or affiliated with municipalities, towns, or cities. There are some exceptions to that rule, but we'll focus on this for purposes of this podcast and vodcast. And so they are not for profit, locally owned, locally controlled. So they are typically governed by city councils or locally elected or appointed boards. So and often they are still what is called vertically integrated. So if they have their own power generation, they control that. In some cases, they also control their bulk transmission. But in many cases, they're distribution only. So they're buying power from third parties. So in terms of their view, they are providing power at cost to their customers. They live and work in that community. They're not 3 states away. And they care about economic development. They care about affordability, reliability, and also, sustainable energy. So that's the way that they view the world. And so, in some ways that can differ from their colleagues in the rest of the industry.
So, but they're not for profit, so that separates them from the investor-owned utilities.
Right.
Is there a big difference then between the public power entities and the cooperatives, or are they more closely aligned than the investor-owned utilities?
They're certainly more closely aligned to us, but as their name indicates, they are providing service in very rural areas. They were kind of that last mile. It reminds me of broadband, how we talk about it today. They were really incentivized to bring electricity to farmers and ranchers back in the day. As communities have spread out into sort of suburbs and exurbs, rural co-ops are now serving some of those exurbs and suburb communities. So they've gotten a little bit less rural in some areas than they used to be, but they are also not for profit, but they're privately owned. So they're not quite as in the public eye as we are. Our members, like I said, are governed by city councils and boards. So they have, public meetings, very transparent in terms of the way they do business, in terms of the way their rates are developed. So the electric rates are all decided at the local level. Co-ops are a slightly different business model. They have boards that decide those things. So it's different, but we are more aligned usually, at least in terms of marketplace issues, with the rural co-ops than we are with the IOUs, although we're often aligned with the IOUs as well on many other things. So it's not always this divisiveness.
Sure. So then in terms of how many customers, the 2,000 different communities roughly. So in terms of the share of annual sales of electricity in the U.S. are about 4,000 terawatt hours. What percentage then of this overall electricity that's sold in the U.S. is due to APPA members?
It's about 15%.
15%.
We're about 15.
Right.
Yeah. So, and it varies from state to state, as you can imagine. We have some states that are more public power than others. Nebraska is 100% public power and co-ops, but primarily public power in that state. And then we have some states like Washington State that's 50%, 50. California is 25%. Your state of Texas is about 25%. So it varies from place to place, but overall it's about 15, which is still a lot.
I was surprised in looking at your website, because I think in Texas here we have more than 80 different public power entities, and then another 75 or 80, well, about 76 electric co-ops. But I want to come back to the issue of the blackouts in just a moment. But before we get to that, I want to just get your thoughts on this, because in my new book, and I'm always plugging the new book.
Yeah, of course.
But I have a table in here about, it's called America's Crazy Quilt Electric Grid. And this is 2016, it's APPA numbers. 189 investor-owned utilities, 88 million customers, 2013 publicly owned with 21 million, 877 cooperatives, 218 power marketers, 9 federal power agencies, 3,300 different electric providers is the bottom line. I look at that and I still find it rather surprising that there is the U.S. The ownership of the American grid is the most diffused of any country in the world. And some of that's I think clearly the legacy of the New Deal. But my question is this: are you ever amazed that it all works? I mean, with these different entities and how complex the system is, that all of these different entities can somehow work together?
So it's so interesting that you say that, because we're also the most reliable grid in the world, at least according to the knowledge I have from some of the 20th century reports, and sort of how we're clearly the wealthiest country in the world. And I don't think it's a mistake or I don't think that has nothing to do with the fact that we have an electric power grid. I'm saying that awkwardly, but I think the fact that our grid is so reliable.
If I can say it maybe less awkwardly, because we have reliable electricity, and enables wealth, that this is one of the
100%. And so that diffuse nature of our grid, I think it's not all a result of the New Deal. Public power utilities, the first one started in 1880 in Wabash, Indiana. So public power has been around since the beginning. It's that last mile, the rural co-ops came along as kind of part of that 1930s New Deal era. But the electric sector was well along its way before that happened, and public power is part of that. And I think what we serve back historically is what we call a yardstick. That we are providing electricity at cost, and electric utilities are natural monopolies. And knowing that we're providing electricity at cost, you can benchmark that markup that the investor and utilities are getting for their profit. So it's a nice way of kind of levelizing things and not having things kind of spin out of control on the for-profit side. It really balances out our sector, I think. But back to your point about, well, there's so many entities in the sector, how does it all work well together? First of all, I think this is where we do link arms. You were talking about the differences earlier and how we might vary in terms of our business models and our focus, but where we completely link arms is on that reliability piece. So as the bulk power system, what we call the bulk power system, which is those large transmission lines and generating facilities, as that was really starting to be integrated heavily kind of after World War II, we came together as an industry and developed a group called the North American Electric Reliability Council to ensure that the bulk power system was maintained at a reliable level to the benefit of everyone participating in it. So that's one way as an industry we've come together closely for decades. And we actually promulgated and supported promulgation of mandatory standards for reliability that were eventually included in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. And that was, again, an industry-wide endeavor. So I think that's where we have aligned so well. But the reason why I think we continue to have these diffuse distribution utilities is because there are some very specific things that localities and certain states want out of their electric grids that others do not. We back to kind of that question around the blackout situations in California and Texas. They're very different states, as you know, living in one of them. And those states want different things out of their grids, and they should be able to ensure that those different needs, policy decisions, and goals are met. And also at the local level, the distribution level, that the towns and cities that we support in my part of the sector can have goals that maybe a town in the West doesn't have the same goals as a town in the East or in the Midwest. In some cases, they share goals. but it becomes a very local decision, an economic development decision about what those rates look like, what the mix of the fuel mix will be, those types of things. And I think that has really empowered communities to do different things with their grids.
So fair enough. Let me follow up then about the California and Texas blackouts. I've done a number of podcasts looking at what happened. What are your takeaways? Why did they happen? Or what are the similarities and what are the differences between the blackouts in the two states? And why did they happen?
So I think it's important to remember, and I'm sure you touched on this, I know you have, that what happened was did not just impact Texas. There was an Arctic storm that came down and it in fact impacted the entire middle of the country. So these cold temperatures that were happening had significant impacts elsewhere as well. And in fact, the kind of states right above Texas were really on the edge of some major, and they were even doing some smaller levels of rolling blackouts there to prevent some grid instability and reliability issues. So I think what that is kind of an anomaly. I mean, I think we saw demands in Texas, but also in that whole middle part of the country, demand load, what we call load, it was higher than expected, well above what they expected for that time of the year. Also, so I could parse through what happened kind of above Texas, geographically, or we could focus on Texas. And for right now, I'll just focus on Texas since that was where some of the significant blackouts occurred. But we'd love to kind of come back to some of what happened in other parts of the country as well. But I know that this has already been dissected a lot, but clearly the forecasting was wrong in terms of the temperatures and the significant demand that was going to be put on the system. And because of that in Texas, those months, the February, March months they're called the shoulder months. And so you take some of the generation offline for maintenance. And so some of the generation that could have been available to meet that excess demand was not available. So you sort of had that perfect storm as well. In addition, we have pivoted a lot more toward natural gas use for electricity, away from coal, as there have been, again, those local and state and national decisions made to address greenhouse gas emission reductions. And as we have relied more on natural gas for that electricity production, we have to rely on the supply of natural gas, not just the power generation. You have to get the gas into the power generation facility. We were having issues with the wellheads freezing, natural gas wellheads freezing, because they just don't normally experience those temperatures either. So there are some electric gas coordination issues, what we would call electric gas coordination issues, that still have not been addressed. And frankly, we've been admiring that problem for a while. I would say I don't think the electric sector has had a lot of leverage to really bring the gas suppliers to the table. I mean, there's been discussion, but really to try to get some changes made. So we can't force them to weatherize their wellheads, but hopefully that will be one of the outcomes of this, is that they are going to spend more money doing so in anticipation of some of these extreme weather events. There are also admittedly some power plants in Texas that weren't weatherized. I can tell you many of my members did weatherize their natural gas plants more heavily, but no one really planned on having, for those who still had coal was freezing on the ground. And those are just not the types of steps you normally have to take in Texas. There are steps that you take further north, of course, to weatherize and to have that coal not freeze on the ground. Similarly, we had problems with all generation types with wind turbines freezing. I mean, there were a plethora of weatherization pieces that I think that's probably the biggest thing that can be corrected in the short term. But in terms of getting that supply of natural gas, that is something that the electric sector really needs to try to figure out and manage as we move forward, whether or not, it's through more firm contracts and things like that. So I mean, there's so many things we could talk about here, but if there's additional, focus areas you want me to hit on.
Put one idea to you and get your reaction from it. So one of the guests I've had on the podcast is Meredith Angwin, who's written a great book called Shorting the Grid, which I don't know, I may have sold more books for her than I've sold of my own, but she's a very savvy and very sharp woman. And her takeaway is, well, what's caused the blackouts is she calls it the fatal trifecta. Too much reliance on just-in-time natural gas, to your point. Too much reliance on imports was particularly clear in California, and too much reliance on renewables. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I think that all of those things are true here. We still need baseload, what's known as baseload, so very highly reliable generation sources to ensure we have a reliable system until there is much more affordable and ubiquitous and available battery storage. That is just, let me just be very clear, that doesn't exist yet. People assume it exists. It does not. That level of like utility scale battery storage, that it is there. There's some level there, but at the level we would need it to be able to balance out those intermittent renewables that are wind and solar, we just don't have it. So when the wind goes down, you have to replace that wind generation, for example, with natural gas typically, because it ramps up.
So if I can just jump in for a second here, Joy, because and just to remind everyone, I'm talking to Joy Ditto. She's the president and CEO of the American Public Power Association. You can learn more about them at publicpower.org. But what I hear you saying as well, and when you talk about baseload, because there's some advocates that I've heard say, oh, well, baseload, we don't need baseload anymore. Well, one of the things that Meredith Angwin's point is that, well, we need to assure reliability. We need fuel on site. And you've mentioned coal. Nuclear performed better in Texas than any other form of generation. Coal was second. Gas was third. Should there be some kind of mandates? We talked about weatherization, but should there be some kind of mandates for on-site fuel storage? This was something that the DOE under Rick Perry promoted. It didn't go anywhere, but is that one way that we can bring in more resilience and reliability to the grid?
Well, for natural gas, as I understand it, you can't store natural gas unless there is like caverns that are naturally occurring, and then they get depleted. So unless there's some LNG that's coming online, but it's not very, it's not very big, and it's only giving you like a day or two of additional capacity. So for natural gas, it's not an easy fix. There's not something you can just say, okay, we're going to create storage for that. So I think there's going to have to be some things done between the electric sector and the gas sector, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, around how do we firm up that gas? I mean, we have firm contracts in many cases, but the gas is still going to home heating as a priority matter. How do we kind of figure out how to marry this better as we become larger and larger customers of gas? And I think gas is a very important fuel for us. I would love to keep, and I think our members would love to keep coal in the mix, especially if we could get some sort of very significant and robust carbon capture, and storage, carbon capture utilization and storage, as it's now called. That is, there's been a lot of research into that, and there needs to be more. And we've certainly supported that over the years to try to get us to a point where we could still use coal, because then you could store it on site. And I mean, that's been a big benefit of coal previously, is that on-site storage.
If I can interrupt, because that's an interesting point that you're making, because coal doesn't get much love these days, and coal plants are being shuttered all across the country, even though the U.S. has more coal resources than any other country in the world. So and that was one of the things I think that it's an issue for, speaking of public power, for this Austin Energy, whether they're going to keep the Fayette coal plant that they own a portion of in service. So let me ask you a question. Should the coal plants that are now being considered for retirement, instead, should there be a rethinking on some of this in terms of for reliability and resilience?
Yeah, I mean, I think for my members, they're making those local decisions, as I said. So I'm not going to, the second guess what Austin's considering doing with its coal plant. But I think overall, for our members who want to continue to use coal, we should consider using it as long as we can, while trying to also meet these, goals that we have of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you do that? Again, I think it comes back to some major technology breakthroughs and a need to fund those. And I know, the federal government has been funding a lot of things recently, especially in response to COVID-19. But I think infusions of funding into these types of technologies will be essential to address the greenhouse gas emission issue while keeping electricity reliable and affordable, which is what we have to have it. I mean, in order to maintain the health and welfare of our populace, first and foremost, and then secondly, to maintain our economic viability. So those are the types of things I think we have to keep looking at. We have to keep nuclear in the mix. And I can talk about that if you're ready for me to.
Sure.
Which
Well,
I mean, we are.
That was one of my questions. I want to come back to nuclear though, but if you could just because I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. In my view, if we're serious about CO2 emissions, we have to be serious about nuclear. But we're losing nuclear capacity. But just before we leave the blackout issue, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, right? But what's the key takeaway here? What were the key takeaways? Is there one key takeaway from the California and Texas blackouts? Has decarbonization been too much of a priority in over resilience and reliability?
I think we have to. The key takeaway is we still need some level of baseload power while we're in this transition. We have to balance it out. Reliability, affordability, and sustainability are three legs of the stool that all have to be the same length or else it's going to topple over. And perhaps we have been emphasizing one or the other recently. But there are also these other smaller things we can be doing in terms of weatherization. And so it's not all about that piece, but it's certainly a factor. And I think because particularly in California, they have been able to import power from elsewhere in the West. Some of that maybe has been masked a little bit until recently. That you definitely still, intermittency by its very nature, wind and solar is, not on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 or close to it, like some of these other resources are. I think we just have to admit it to ourselves that those resources are still needed, and that let's admit that to ourselves and then plan accordingly so that we can also get the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that everyone wants. So just admitting it in the first instance, I think is probably the upshot from both Texas and California.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. I think that admitting we need baseload and we need that reliable baseload because we risk
absolutely.
As I've looked at the blackout here in Texas, it was so close to complete meltdown. And what would have happened on February 15th if the grid had gone black in Texas? I mean, it scares my pants off if I think about it too much.
Yeah, and I think we saw some of that elsewhere like I said, in the other states kind of above Texas. It was really, frankly, the fact that it didn't happen, so that there wasn't a major meltdown of the grid, is really a tribute to the really smart people and who work in our industry and who were working 24/7 during that time to prevent just that. But we have to get better. We can't have the situation happen again. I agree.
So let's talk about nuclear then. You brought that up, and Texas has two nuclear plants, 4 reactors. Those 3 of them stayed online. One of them went off at the South Texas project because I think there was a meter froze or something, but it was brought back up within 36 hours. Can the U.S. achieve its decarbonization goals without nuclear?
No, not with current technology. So we have to keep it in the mix. We have to add to our fleet and in our view as public power. So, we have long supported nuclear in our sector. We were talking about who we were a little bit. We're smaller, often distribution. We often are purchasing power, but we have partnered in nuclear facilities for many years. And one that's being added to right now, one of the few new nuclear facilities in the country that's a big, large scale nuclear, is in Georgia at Plant Vogtle, and we are partners in that as public power and as co-ops. Often don't hear about our partnership, but we're actually a majority partner in that plant. And so we have long supported it. It's expensive. I mean, to build new nuclear is very expensive, but the fact that you can run nuclear at such high capacity, so you can actually keep it on for so much of the day, night, all of the year, is so important to that technology. And we've even improved the capacity of existing nuclear reactors. We need to look at more advanced nuclear reactors. But I think another really exciting technology that we are that we are involved in as public power is called small modular reactors. And I know you
Sure.
know about those very
Yes.
well. And it's been supported by the federal government through NewScale. There's a consortium of public power utilities and rural electric cooperatives that are actually in that project now, going forward with small modular, with the small modular reactors. It's so exciting. So I think that's another place we need to focus. But the other piece is keeping the existing nuclear fleet online. And there have been some challenges in certain markets there.
Sure. Well, let me follow on that, because I published a piece in Forbes on Inauguration Day, in fact, saying if Biden is serious about decarbonization, they shouldn't allow these existing plants that are slated for closure, Byron and Dresden in Illinois this year, and Unit 3 at Indian Point. I'm going to ask you that question directly. Why isn't there more? I'll ask it directly. You've got the Biden administration talking about nuclear, but they've effectively done nothing to try and keep these plants open. I mean, is the decarbonization effort by the Biden administration doomed to fail if they can't keep existing reactors open?
Yeah, I think it's it's a more complex issue than is at face value.
Here, Joy,
a lot of, I don't know, but I'm just wanting to, I'll just share with you, there are these marketplaces that have been created. They're marketplaces, quote unquote, that are called regional transmission organizations or independent system operators that are sort of these quasi federal entities. They're blessed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They operate on a regional basis. They have some benefits, and actually Texas has one, ERCOT that well, sure. that made some missteps during the Texas crisis, but also did some things right as well. But these regional entities are intended to help provide more opportunities for bigger swaths of a region to access different types of generation. That helps with some of the intermittency issue when you can access wind from one part of the region and if it's not blowing in another part of the region, for example. But it also helps just with other economies of scale and theoretically to bring prices down.
But is the point, though, that they can't go and say, well, we're going to favor nuclear over gas? I mean, that they're not set up.
Exactly.
The point is that they're not set up to assure reliability, so that there's no...
Exactly. So I was getting to that point. Yeah, I was getting to that point. So, I mean, basically, these theoretical constructs have had challenges in terms of that assurance of reliability and prioritizing plants to stay online. It's become an economic decision to close some of these nuclear plants because gas has been so cheap. Natural gas has been so cheap that in some of these marketplaces, nuclear is not as economic as gas. So it's been closing because of economic reasons rather than, again, valuing those three legs of the stool. Like I was talking about, valuing reliability, economics, or affordability, as well as sustainability. That's not in the mix. It's only about the economics in these markets. So we do have to get back to that. Some of it's a state issue, some of it's a federal issue. And I'm hopeful that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is going to look at this again. I know in the Trump administration, there was some talk about, looking at nuclear and coal, especially as sort of these valuable baseload sources. And there was controversy around that, particularly because of coal, I think.
Right.
But I think coming back to it and seeing it in the context of the winter storm that happened and the challenges in California, I think are really important to revisit that. And certainly it's something we would support revisiting and are hopeful that will be revisited with the current FERC.
Well, would that cure have to be then some kind of, let's call it, what is it, a subsidy at the federal level, similar to the investment tax credit or production tax credit for the nuclear plants to keep them from closing? Because if it boils down to economics, well, then the owners, Exelon, has said Byron and Dresden aren't profitable, so we're going to close them. So, nobody wants to have a bake sale for Exelon, but at the same time, is the federal government the only entity really at this point that can step in to make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's a subsidy or if it just changes to the way the rules of the road are governed in these markets. I mean, if you can place a value on that reliability piece that is an economic value, then perhaps that's the way to address it rather than kind of throwing more money at it. And I'll tell you that we have concerns about throwing money at these generating facilities without any assurance that the reliability piece is going to be met, because we're buying from those, our members are buying from those facilities. So I think for us, it's about how do you value reliability within the marketplace, right? So there could just be some market rules changes that could be considered. And I know FERC is already, has several sort of technical conferences scheduled that are coming up, that whereby this could be, part of that discussion, and hopefully will be. So I don't know if it has to be a subsidy, or if it's really more about the rules of the road and the value within the marketplace that's being placed on these facilities.
I agree. It's just that the time is running out. I mean, the Indian Point plant is slated for closure at the end of April, and I don't know what the timelines were for Byron and Dresden. But let me move on then to the Biden administration and their claims that they're under the the energy efficiency and clean energy standard that Biden is promoting. Saying that they're going to decarbonize the electric grid in the U.S. by 2035, get rid of all coal and natural gas. Is that a realistic goal?
So for us in Public Power, we think a more realistic goal will be a 2050 goal. It would still be hard to achieve in 2050. So by no means would that be something easy. We're okay with hard goals, but it's more realistic, we believe, to look at a 2050 target for that net zero goal. And again, there's still not the technology in place to even achieve that net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but we just believe that that's just a more realistic and appropriate goal, with a bunch of new technology coming online to achieve it, with maintaining our nuclear fleet like we've just talked about. So again, still a hard goal, but much more achievable than the 2035.
So in 15, not achievable. In 30, still going to be hard. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
Yes, fair assessment of what I'm saying. Yeah, and again, we want to be part of the solution. So it's not just that I'm saying no. It's just that we believe that affordability and reliability, as we've just talked about, are still so important. And having that net zero component come in 15 years, we just don't think that's achievable with current technology.
So let me go back to the resilience and reliability issue, because a lot of talk about electric vehicles and adding EV charging stations, and the investor-owned utilities are all in favor. And as I see it, if I'm going to think about it cynically, well, sure, they're in favor, because then they get the rate base, the cost of the EV infrastructure, they get to sell more electricity and so on. But when I look at the electric sales in the United States, have been flat for 15 years. I mean, we're not selling more watt hours every year. In fact, the efficiency has done remarkable things to reduce that consumption.
Right.
So if the build out and the electrify everything push is gaining ground, banning natural gas and putting more load on the grid, what effect is that likely to have on rates?
Well, that's a great question, actually. Well, I mean, I think we have to plan for that additional load if we get it. I mean, there's debate, I think, about what that is going to look like if we fully electrify transportation, for example, but because there's going to be some synergies you get with using, plugging vehicles in at night, and there's some efficiencies you're going to even gain in the grid by doing that. So how much that load is going to look like is up for debate a little bit. But assuming that we put more load on our sector, I think that that's not necessarily going to put upward pressure on rates. I think that the rates piece the upward pressure is going to come from, again, how are we managing this transition to net zero emissions, to the cleaner energy future? That's, to me, where the rate debate is more significant. In terms of EV infrastructure and charging, I mean, there has been some good, I think, bipartisan, and it's such a difficult time in Washington to even be able to say things are bipartisan. I think it's really positive, and that's one of the areas where you've seen a lot of bipartisan agreement, which is in getting some of the charging infrastructure more affordable, putting some incentives in place for that. We've seen some specifically for our sector of the industry, since we can't take advantage of tax incentives directly. So we've seen some support for that for us in the rural co-ops to get some of that charging infrastructure in place. We have programs that our utilities provide at the local level, just to sort of get their communities needs met, because some in their communities want to see EVs more fully available, and that comes with the charging infrastructure. So we've seen some of our small utilities, frankly, take on that issue and try to bring that about in their communities. So it's not just for the big utilities. And I mean, I think that, again, the good part about public power is when we spend money on those things, it's very much a local decision and can be offset maybe by other things. So whether it's a additional, or it can be an opt-in. You know, some of our folks can just say, you mentioned energy efficiency. Our energy efficiency programs have been exceedingly helpful and popular, but we allow our community members to opt into those programs, right? So that's how we're kind of approaching the EV scenario as well.
So you mentioned some of the small members of APPA, and again, my guest is Joy Ditto. She's the president and CEO of the American Public Power Association. She's had that job for 15 months, if my memory serves.
Yeah, it's really a short amount of time, but I've been in the industry for 20 years, so I've been around.
So you can find Joy and more about the Public Power Association at publicpower.org. So smallest and largest. Who's your biggest member? Who's the smallest? Do you know these off the head?
I don't know if I know the exact smallest. I think that's kind of up for debate, but I'll just give you a sense of the size. So our largest member, and again, it kind of depends on how you slice the numbers, but our largest member is typically cited as Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in the LA area. Although there are some that are kind of biting at their heels. Salt River Project, which serves the Phoenix area, New York Power Authority, which is a wholesale provider in New York. But Los Angeles, by most measurements, is our largest. We have one community in Kansas I know of that has 30 customers, 30, and we have some public power utilities in Alaska that are that size, that are providing, power just in a very small town, small borough. So
well,
it's an amazing difference.
Huge variability in the sizes.
Mm-hmm.
In looking at the cooperative world, I think I found the smallest one. There's one in Wyoming. I think they have 70 meters, which is not very many. So similar in the disparity in scale. I think the largest co-op is Pedernales Electric Co-op here just outside of Boston, 300,000 some odd meters. So, but how are those different? The interests of the small one. I mean, you've got in your job. It's a political job you have. I'm sure you recognize this.
I do.
Differences between the interests of the very small public power entities versus the ones that are very large. I mean, they're similar in some similarities in their, I would assume, in their interest. How do you see that in terms of the small versus big players in your own organization? How do you work with all of them, make sure you're actually representing their interests the best?
So that's a great question. So I've long seen our membership, because I've been CEO for 15 months, but I was here for 15 years before that in a sort of government relations capacity. I've long seen our membership as a microcosm of the US, because we have small towns in the US, we have big cities, we have blue states, we have red states, we have purple states, and my members are in all of those places. And they are feeling the same sort of pressures and desires from their communities that we sort of see reflected in our political environment. So what we do to try to bridge that and get people to well, first of all, there's mutual respect. There's a lot of respect within our industry about whatever a community is dealing with elsewhere in the country. One of our members in Washington State is going to very much understand and appreciate that they are not the same as someone in Georgia, necessarily. But although there's nuclear in Washington State too, and there's nuclear in Georgia, so they may have some similarities there. But there is a lot of respect for the political environment in each of those communities. So they come at these discussions about policy very much from that perspective. But we have a very robust policy process where our members actually get to vote on our policy resolutions and drive toward that consensus. And we obviously break it down. And things like climate change, we have a group that is a representative sampling of our members, large, small, medium, from various parts of the country, that get together to kind of flesh out the details, and then it goes to our bigger membership. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there in our broader political environment in other issues. I think, first of all, we need to be respectful toward each other and think about how others, may not be dealing with the same situation in their communities that we are, and actually have open dialogue. So some of the debates get a little bit heated, and there's arguments, and there's not always perfect agreement, but we drive to that consensus so that we can unify each other, unify our voice in Washington, D.C., and represent the bigger public power view. The commonality we have is that we're all community owned, locally controlled, not-for-profit electric utilities trying to provide highly reliable service at an affordable and sustainable, affordably and sustainably. So that's the common goal. And you'd be surprised at how far that gets you when you get into these more maybe disparate issues.
Sure. So let me revisit this issue of gas and electricity a little bit, because surely one of your members, CPS Energy in San Antonio, now they've sued their gas supplier. They've sued ERCOT. You mentioned your family's from Denton. Denton has sued the ERCOT as well. There's a lot of litigation that's going to happen in the wake of the Texas blackouts. Yeah. But you wrote a piece last month, I believe it was, or maybe it was in January. You pointed to this 2010 study that APPA did on gas and the electric sector. And what, in my view, we've seen a merger of the two sectors, right? They're completely interdependent. But you implied earlier that the electric sector just doesn't have much leverage over the gas sector. Is there, can the farmer and the rancher be friends here? Because
yeah, right.
It seems like there's, there's some enormous, the numbers here with CPS Energy alone, $300 million in the litigation that they're now filed against Energy Transfer. How can that coordination happen? Is this going to be something that's going to have to be mandated? Is that what's next in terms of understanding the criticality of the natural gas fuel for electricity reliability?
Yeah, great question too. Real small piece of history here. In 1978, we were mandated not to use natural gas for electricity, and we were then pushed much more toward coal, right? So we have to keep
Natural Gas and Industrial Fuel Use Act of 1978, right? Something
like
that.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you. And in that, the reason for that is because natural gas was not as abundant, and it's used in so many other different processes, like fertilizer. You mentioned farmers, very familiar with how when fertilizer prices go up, it's very difficult for farmers, and so natural gas is an input to so many different things, also home heating, things like that. So it was discouraged for a long time, but as the supply became much more abundant in our country over the last number of years, it's become more available. And because it's a lower greenhouse gas emitting fuel, it helps us achieve some of those goals as well. So it's a really important component of what we use, what we do with our electric and the electric sector. But these challenges have existed for a long time. And I think again, my hope is that we are able to get some leverage. Is it going to be, are we going to ask for a mandate, or are we just going to ask for some sort of pricing mechanism, perhaps a safety valve of some sort, where if prices get too high on the supply side, because that's part of the issue, is it wasn't just a reliability issue that is significant. We have to address it, but it was that the prices were so there was kind of the electric market prices that were allowed to stay really, really high, and they were supposed to just be boom, you go up and you hit that price and it brings things back down. So there was this length of time that there probably could have been some action taken to reduce that electricity price, but the gas prices were also skyrocketing. Is there market manipulation? We don't know yet. There are investigations going on, but I would remind everyone that in 2000 and 2001, during the Western electricity crisis back then, we did not know about Enron, and you know this well because of what you've written about it. We did not know for months that Enron had manipulated the market. So there may have also been some market manipulation in this scenario, causing those prices on the supply side to skyrocket. We don't know yet. But I think that's the concern, is that we can't let those gas prices stay that high for so long, even when it's a constrained environment. It's just not realistic, given how acutely we need that fuel in the future. So how do we bridge that without getting too much into the marketplace and quelling other innovative things from happening? I think we're still, as APPA, I just have to admit, we're still figuring that out. We haven't decided on a path to recommend to Congress or a regulator yet in terms of what that might look like, but we're in active conversation with our members about what could be a better future for us vis-a-vis the gas industry. I know one thing that we can recommend now, and that's a better alignment of the gas day with the electric day. The electricity, we don't ever sleep in the electric sector. We're available. Our markets are on, all the time, and they actually sort of close down their markets over the weekend. So you have to be purchasing gas before the weekend, and at prices, whatever those rates are.
How the pricing mechanisms then work in the gas market, because that was one of the issues that was at play in Texas. It was a 3-day weekend. For February 15th was President's Day, right? And so some of the spot prices that were in place, as I understand it, on February, what is that? The 15th, 14th, 13th, the
12th or something.
Right.
Yes.
That those prices were supposed to be in effect for the entire weekend, but in fact, that didn't necessarily happen. Okay.
Correct.
Well, so let me jump to a couple of other things, and then I know you have another engagement that you need to go to. When I was working on my book on Enron, which is now 20 years ago, was published almost 20 years ago, which is
crazy,
surprising to me, but nevertheless,
right.
As I was writing that, I was talking to a guy who was in the pipeline business, and he said, look, this electric deregulation, he said, it's not going to be good for the consumer. So direct question was, you represent public power entities that I live in Austin. I don't get to choose my provider. Austin Energy is my provider. I'm not a dissatisfied customer. Was deregulation of the electricity market was a good idea? Was it good for consumers?
So there's the retail deregulation that you all have in Texas, and you're the only state that has it. It's really pretty much been rolled back in all the other states, and not every state ever engaged in retail deregulation. We were not supportive of that, or we wanted to maintain essentially our vertical integration, and so we don't think that it was a good idea. We think just because of the nature of electricity, you can't replace it, you can't really store it for lengths of time. There's these sort of things that shifted into sort of more the monopoly. The infrastructure is very expensive. It's very capital intensive. So we don't think it lends itself to true competition on the retail side. The wholesale deregulation, which we kind of were talking about a little bit earlier when we were talking about RTOs and ISOs, there have been some benefits, but some drawbacks to that, right? And some of these market mechanisms that don't value reliability, they value capacity, which is different than actually having the fuel. I mean, you can have a bunch of power plants standing by, but if the fuel's not there, when we were talking earlier about, the fuel being on site, and that's a different scenario, that's a supply issue. And it goes back to the conversations we need to have with natural gas suppliers, and hopefully getting some additional leverage there. But, that is not really been addressed in these deregulated wholesale markets, as it were. So I hope that we will revisit that, both kind of at the state. There's a state federal nexus within our sector, both at the state level and at the federal level. We need to rethink how we value reliability and supply, and that's it. I don't have all of the answers yet as to how we should do that, but I know I'll just tell you again, and I told you how we develop our policies. We're talking about it with our members who've been impacted, and we will get to some recommendations, hopefully in the near term, that we can better discuss. But I think we will need to make some changes.
Well, I think that's an interesting. I like the way you put that. That rethink this. The how did you put it? The rethink reliability and supply issues. But then, as you even talk about that, and I think I understand kind of the oil and gas industry a little bit, but when I look at the electric sector, I think, God, it's so complicated. You've got the local entities, you've got the state government that has some regulatory authority, you have the RTOs, you have FERC, you have all these overlays that all fit together and have to, in some way, sing from the same hymnal. But that one idea, I'll just run, as you said that, as I've thought about what happened in Texas, I wonder if the policymakers that decided how to structure this market just didn't understand the nature of electricity itself, that they thought you could sell it, a watt hour is like a hamburger, but they didn't understand, no, this is the mother network. You can't shut this off, and you can't risk shutting it off because of the danger of that. Does that ring true to you? Just that there's a misunderstanding of what electricity is and its importance? Does that make sense to you?
I think there often is. I would love to see more education on it, even at the like elementary, secondary level. I do think that there are misunderstandings about what electricity is, how it can be used, especially as we're in this sort of transition. And we do have new technologies that have come online and that have been successful, but we still don't have other technologies that are very necessary to doing what we really want to do. So I agree, there is misunderstanding, and it's podcasts like this that can help with that understanding. And it's really interesting as I was thinking about what's going to be my ask, because I know you like to have, what's going to be my ask is that people educate themselves on the complexity. And again, complexity is not always bad. It's provided, we have, again, an extraordinary system in our country that really serves many needs. Most of the time, we have these anomalies where we see situations occur that should never occur, and we have to be able to fix them. But you're right, it goes back to our policymakers need to be fully educated and understand an industry that's complex and requires more than a cursory knowledge. You have to dig a little bit deeper. You have to be a little bit more aware. But I can tell you as a non-engineer, it's an exciting industry and the complexity is kind of interesting. So I would just encourage that people get to, read your book, go to our website, publicpower.org, and yeah, and educate yourselves. And there are people available to talk to you about it too, if you ever even want to dig deeper.
Sure. So I have one other question. Well, just a couple I saw in your bio, you're a competitive equestrian in the sport of eventing. Now I've looked this up. You do dressage, cross country, and show jumping. Do you have a horse?
I do. I have a thoroughbred.
Oh yeah.
I do. Her name is Virginia.
Invest in anything that eats. That's what I've been told. But
right now.
But so you're active
like
now, or
I mean, it isn't.
You have time to manage the horse and everything else you're doing.
It's not like, as you were implying, it's an expensive proposition for a hobby. But I've held on to it. I've been a rider my whole life. Started when I was 5 years old, and so yes, I have a horse. I get to see her a couple times a week. I have a trainer help ride her as well, so that she gets exercise. But I do still do it, and I love it. And it's kind of a mental health thing too. I think we all need to have something that we do for ourselves. And so I'm very privileged and blessed.
Are you competing still?
Oh, probably sometime this summer. I am right now. My horse is a little bit had an injury, so I'm not this moment. But I'm hoping that in the summer I'll get back to it. And she'll be ready to go.
I'd ask about your kids, but what's the horse's name?
Her name is Virginia is for Lovers, because that's our moniker in Virginia. I live in Virginia. Virginia is for Lovers is like a slogan. And so her name is Virginia is for Lovers, but she goes by Ginny, Ginny.
Got it. Last two questions. And my guest is Joy Ditto. She's the president and CEO of the American Public Power Association. You can find more about her at publicpower.org. What are you reading? You a fiction reader, nonfiction reader? What's on your read?
I'm all of it. I'm all of the above. And I listen to audiobooks a lot in the car. And so, especially when I'm going out to see my horse. Right now, I just got finished reading the latest Stephen King called Later. That's my like, just when I don't want to think about anything.
Scary
and then I just read, when I just read, also for work, it's called The Ideal Team Player. I don't know if you ever read The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, but it's kind of it's a management book by the same guy about the ideal team player. So just trying to make sure my team is operating optimally here at APPA.
Last question.
What about you? I want to hear about what you're reading.
Oh gosh.
Are you reading I want to read your book.
I snack a lot.
I'm not supposed to be asking the questions, but I want to read your book next. So that's going to be
Question of Power. You don't have to read it. You just have to buy it. That's the old joke. Yeah, a Question of Power. It's really good. It's out on Amazon and every other retailer. The last full book that I read was A Gentleman in Moscow, which I just loved. And I read a lot of sections of books. I don't generally read them front to back, but nevertheless, that's one. But I'll hit you with the final question here. So, Joy, what gives you hope?
Oh, what gives me hope is that we all, at the end of the day, need electricity. and we all should figure out a way to optimize it and come together around that. What also gives me hope is that we are free in this country, and it's a beautiful thing to see that freedom put into practice. So that's very hopeful. Looking at my 13 and 9-year-old children, my girls are also very hopeful. Last is, I would say, I mean, the fact that we have a vaccine to combat this virus in a year, and it's being rolled out better than anywhere else in the country. I mean, in the world, in this country, is incredible. And that is super hopeful to me. So I think that's where I would stop.
I got a shot last week, and
So
it was just amazing to see all the volunteers there. I mean, there were dozens of them, and I thought, wow,
oh yeah,
it was great.
yeah.
I mean,
It's incredible. I mean, think
an amazing event.
Well, and think about that complexity right there, and how we're doing it so well in our country. We're really good at logistics.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's amazing. Congratulations on your shot. I haven't gotten mine yet, but hopefully soon.
Yeah. Well, listen, Joy, you've been very kind with your time. My guest again, to all you in podcast land, my guest is Joy Ditto. She's the president and CEO of the American Public Power Association. You can read up on her at publicpower.org. This has been another episode. You wasted, as the Click and Clack used to say on the Tappet Brothers, you wasted a perfectly good hour here at the Power Hungry Podcast, but come back anyway. And if you like it, give us a bunch of stars on your favorite podcast platform. And we will see you on the next. Thanks again to you, Joy. And we will see the rest of you back for another edition of the Power Hungry Podcast.